welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. I am so excited to be here today. You've been listening to episodes from me every week for the past month, but I spent all of September on the road. I haven't been in studio at all. I was road tripping all across the West. I was visiting a few different national parks. I was at Grand Teton in Yellowstone in Wyoming. I was at Olympic National Park in Washington. I took a trip to Yosemite in California. And it was absolutely amazing. It was so nice to be on the road. It was so lovely to be traveling. But I am very happy to be back in studio and to be recording again. I have a lot of exciting things queued up for you in terms of conversations to be had and topics to be explored over the next couple of months. But before we get started today, I have a little bit of personal news. I'm known for gesturing while I'm talking, so you will notice this once I get started. But I have a ring on my finger. I am recently engaged. I'm getting married next year to an absolutely wonderful man. He was also homeschooled for part of his childhood. And we talked on our very first date about our shared desire to homeschool our future children. I am very excited to be embarking on the adventure of a marriage, but I'm also very excited about starting a family of my own if we are so blessed, because obviously I care about education very much. I talk a lot about my own upbringing and the education that I got to have, and I am so excited to get to be the steward of hopefully the education of future children. When that time does come, this podcast is going to get very interesting because we're going to start talking about all of the things that are relevant to the stage of motherhood that I am in, which I am very excited about. But today, I want to talk about my own education a little bit. We don't have a guest today. Instead, I want to dig into a topic that I have been dying to do an episode on for quite some time now, which is one of the most cliche things to hear come up when you're talking about homeschooling, which is, if you don't send your kids to public school, will they be properly socialized? And this question is a great pet peeve of mine. I have many thoughts about it, and I've talked about this extensively in other episodes. I've talked about this on Twitter. I've talked about this on Instagram, but I am very excited to actually do an episode where I can delve into all of my thoughts about this because I have quite a bit to say. And I don't think we even think about the question correctly. And I want to challenge the entire framing of the thing in today's episode. There will very likely be a second episode following this that delves a little bit more into the research and some of the actual statistics and facts around what we know about socialization and the importance of it. But I want today's episode to be a little bit more anecdotal because I had experience with this growing up homeschooled. And I feel very lucky to have had the experience that I had, even in the points in time where in the moment, I really wished I was having a different experience. And I want to talk about why I feel that I got really lucky and why I feel, because of that experience, that maybe the entire conversation about how we socialize our kids deserves to change. So when we talk about homeschooling kids, one of the very first things that people bring up in challenge to the very idea of homeschooling is that if your children will not be in a traditional school environment where they are around peers for 6 to 8 hours a day, how will they be properly socialized? And I want to challenge the entire notion of proper socialization. And I want to ask the question, is socialization actually an important thing? And is that level of socialization a good thing? There was a phenomenal essay published last year by a Swedish writer named Henrik Karlsson, who I had on the podcast some months ago. And it's called The Childhoods of Exceptional People. And I would highly recommend reading it. It's very good. In order to write this essay, which was effectively just an exploration of Henrik's curiosity around what is the upbringing of an exceptional person like, and are there patterns between different individuals? He read a very large number of biographies of a very large number of differing historical figures. And he did a range of different figures. He talked about some writers like Leo Tolstoy and Virginia Woolf. He talked about musicians like Mozart and Bach. He talked about philosophers like Rene Descartes. And he noticed a number of patterns and similarities across the different biographies that he read. And one of the things that he noticed as being consistent across many of these exceptional individuals is the fact that most of them had relatively isolated childhoods. Most of them did not grow up in urban areas. If they did, they were somewhat separated from most of their peers. They either suffered from an illness in their childhoods, or they were in a location where there just weren't many other children of their own age to be constant playmates. And because of this, they were forced to spend the bulk of their time either with other adults or alone. And in the time that they spent alone, many of them became bored. And in that time that they became bored is when they began the early stages of the work that they went on to do in their adult lives and that they became known for. They started writing. They started asking philosophical questions. They started grappling with mathematical challenges. They did the things that they ultimately became notable for. And while these are exceptional people, they are not the norm. Most children are not going to grow up to be Leo Tolstoy or Rene Descartes, probably to their benefit. They will not live those lives. There is something of this that I think is very important, which is the observation that when children have time to be alone, they have time to explore things that are uniquely theirs. And this is one of the first things from my own childhood that I want to talk about and that I want to emphasize. I was homeschooled 1st grade through 12th grade, as most of you know. And in that time, I engaged in a wide array of social experiences. I was part of homeschooling co-ops where my family took classes and I was able to take things like Spanish and drama and other classes that parents didn't feel qualified to teach on their own, so they'd hire a professional teacher and pool their resources to pay the bill, and we'd all learn together whatever topic we were being taught. We joined different extracurricular activities. I sang in choirs for a long time. I was part of book clubs. I experimented with different sports. I had a very broad range of social experiences and social outlets, but it was not even close to being on par with the social level of socialization that I would have had if I were in a traditional school. Most weeks I saw kids my own age once or twice a week. And during the off seasons, the winter break, or over the summer, when there was no school, sometimes I would go weeks at a time without seeing another child my own age. And this was true for the bulk of my childhood. I would have play dates sometimes with friends. I would do various social things, but it didn't have the level of structure nor the level of regularity that the average child is going to experience when they're around their peers. Many hours a day, 5 days plus a week. And at times, this was very lonely. I am a very social person. I am definitely an extrovert. I daydreamed about having friends as a child. I had imaginary friends. I thought sometimes that if I just went to public school, there would be tons of kids that I would love to be friends with, just there waiting for me to come along so that we could all have a grand time together. The desire for that, however, was never strong enough that I actually advocated for going to public school. I really did want to still be homeschooled. I just liked the idea of having more friends than I did. But because I had ample space where I was not being influenced by the whims of the crowd or the pressures or interests of my peers, I spent the bulk of my free time doing things that I uniquely found interesting. I spent hours and hours and hours a week reading. I spent hours every day writing. I spent time doing art. I spent time just playing outside and being a kid. And as I got older, that time got directed into things that more and more closely resembled the things that I began doing as I entered into adulthood. I spent tons of time reading and writing. Anybody who knows me knows that as an adult, that is a very large part of what I spend my days doing. And it's a lot of what I've built my career around. I read and write about education. I run a marketing agency where I do writing for a living. And there's a very clear through line between the activities that I chose to do in my own time and the things that I do now as a vocation, as an adult. And I think that's really important because I know that I was a very socially motivated child. I also was severely bullied when I was in kindergarten. Before I started homeschooling in first grade, I went to a private preschool in kindergarten, and I was heavily bullied in my kindergarten year by the rest of my class. And I know how badly that hurt. I know how much I would have been willing to do as a child to avoid having that experience again, including being interested in and mirroring the behaviors of the people around me to make sure that I fit in to a point that I would not be an obvious target to get picked on. And I know that doing those things would have pushed me away from a lot of the things that I found interesting. When I was in high school, I wanted to read the great books. I went down weird rabbit holes reading medieval poetry and Greek tragedies, things that I likely would have been mocked for in traditional school as being a nerd. But I loved them and I wanted to study them. And so I did. But I didn't have to worry about whether or not the other kids at school were going to bully me for it because I wasn't in a social environment where it mattered. I was around other peers, but I was around them in contexts where what I spent my school time doing didn't matter and they didn't have to know. But I was also in groups of people that were heavily selected based on interest. So I was part of book clubs where we were discussing books that I found interesting. I was singing in choirs with kids who were maybe a little more nerdy anyway than the sort of average student population of a public school. And because of all of that, I was able to do these things that I was interested in without fearing the social backlash of a peer group that thought I was weird for the things I was interested in and put me in a position where I had to choose between social acceptance or following the things I was uniquely interested in. But more importantly, because I had all of this time, I was bored. And because I was bored, I had to find things that interested me to fill my time with. And those things turned out to be writing, which I spent years in retrospect effectively training for the work that I do now, even though at the time I didn't know that was what I was doing. And reading, which again was building the foundation for me for all of the work and the intellectual explorations and the learnings that I do now as an adult. And in my adulthood, I feel like I've learned a very important lesson from all of this, because in my adulthood, whenever I feel creatively stifled or stagnant, or I feel too distracted and I'm not doing things that I feel are really growing me and pushing me and challenging me to be better than I was a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, I open up space to be bored. I stop saying yes to social obligations. I stop filling up my time with busy work, and I make space to feel frustratingly bored, which then leads me to start thinking creatively and brings me back to the things that at my core I am most interested in and I'm most good at. And I learned that skill because I spent so much time as a child not being overstimulated socially. I would argue, and this is controversial every time I post this on Twitter, but I stand by this. I would argue that we over-socialize our kids. Our kids spend, on average, 8+ hours a day with other children of their own age. There is no historical precedent for this. At no other time in human history has this been the norm for how kids spend their childhoods. But it's also detrimental to their own development. This is not scientific. I will make the scientific arguments later. This is purely anecdotal. And this is purely based on my own experience, the experience of other children that I have observed, the experiences of the kids that I've worked with in the past. When kids spend all of their time in structured environments and with other people, they have no time and space to do the things that are interesting to them. If your child is in a classroom from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., and then they leave the classroom and they get on a bus and go home in a bus full of other kids, they're around other stimulation the entire time. They have no time to think for themselves, to do something on their own. Maybe they're going home and hanging out with other kids. Again, maybe they're going to daycare after school until their parents are finished with work. Often these kids have extracurriculars. So instead of getting on the bus, they're going to join the sports team or practice for the school play or go to band practice. Whatever they're doing, they're so busy with other people's inputs and other people's expectations of them that they never have a chance to discover what it is that they would do if they were in charge of their time and if they weren't making decisions based on the approval or disapproval of their social networks. Most kids never have the chance to ask those questions, and they go through their entire childhoods spending the bulk of their time socializing. And they go to college and again are spending the bulk of their time socializing. And much of this socialization is valuable. They're learning how to interact with other people. They're often debating ideas. They're being exposed to new things. They're learning about the world around them. But they're always distracted by other people. They go through a full college experience of being around their peers 24/7. And at the end of it, they've been spit out into the next stage of life, which is career. And they followed the path most often that's been presented to them because that's all they know. So they went through their entire childhoods being prepared for college. They went through college being prepared for a career. They've chosen a career path at the advice and perhaps encouragement of both the peers around them and the adults who are their advisors. And now they're starting a career that in large part was encouraged for them by the people that they've been socializing with this entire time, and is not necessarily the thing they would have chosen if they were left alone to discover for themselves what they found interesting and what they want to do. But because they were around so many people, they never had a chance to ask those questions. And I think that in and of itself is reason to pause and ask, is this truly the most beneficial way for our children to be prepared for adulthood, to make all of their decisions while being surrounded by a committee, even if they're not involving the committee in that decision, and to never have a chance to be bored enough and solitary enough to figure out if other people aren't pushing them towards things, what do they want to do? That's my first argument for why we're thinking about the socialization question correctly. We're setting the norm in the very contemporary sense, not the historical norm, as the baseline, and then asking if your child isn't getting that, how do we know they're going to be okay? And I don't think that's the right question to ask. One of the implications of will your child be socialized if they don't go to public school is, will your child be normal if they don't go to public school? This is really what people are asking. Is your child going to be weird? Are they going to know how to talk to their peers? Are they going to know how to not be awkward in public if they're not in school all day? And I think the entire definition of normal also deserves challenging. My friend Matt Bateman, who I've also had on the podcast, he's very prolific on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you should absolutely be following him. His content is fantastic. He's brilliant. He talks about the difference between normal and common and how we often conflate the two things. And his argument is that there are lots of things that we think are normal behaviors for children that are actually just common but maladapted. The child who is developing properly and with the proper inputs would not actually be experiencing these things, but we think they're normal because everyone experiences them. One of the examples he uses is the moody adolescent. His argument is that it's not actually normal in the sense of healthy for an adolescent to be moody all the time. It's common and in that sense normal because it's the experience of the majority of teenagers you've probably interacted with over the course of your life. But these children are this way because of the environmental inputs and stimuli that they're exposed to. They're forced to sit in school all day. They're not given any independence and agency. They're not allowed to follow the normal developmental track that they're biologically hardwired to be on. And because of that, they feel frustrated, they feel angsty, and we think those behaviors are normal. I think this is a really valuable frame to look at things through because we're worried about our children not being normal if they don't go to public school. But we have to ask two questions. One, what is the normal that we're talking about? And is it a thing to aspire to? And two, is that normal even a healthy normal, or is it just a common normal? It's normal for kids to go to school and be bullied by their peers. It's normal for teenagers to feel anxiety and depression. It's normal for kids to be apathetic about learning and depressed or even frightened of their future. Those things are normal in the sense of common. It's the experience of many kids who are going to traditional school. But is it normal as in healthy? Is it normal as in this is the experience that we're hardwired to have? And I would argue no. From the stance of normal as in healthy, most kids going to traditional school and having a normal socialization experience, an average socialization experience, are not normal as in healthy. They're just having an experience that is common and that we've mistaken as being the baseline. Kids who go to public school are being exposed to all kinds of social pressures that the average person doesn't have to experience for the rest of their lives. Kids are in social environments where they're being exposed to children only of the same age, which makes the competition for social status incredibly intense. And the result of this is often bullying and children being emotionally and sometimes physically abused by their peers. In no other place in this child's life will they again be exposed to such treatment. First of all, as an adult, they'll have agency. So if they find themselves in such a situation again, they will have the ability to say, I don't want to be here. This is not an environment that brings me any joy or happiness or even a sense of safety, and I want to leave. And they'll be able to leave because no one is coercing them to be there. But when they're in school, they're not allowed to leave. They get in trouble if they try to leave. And so they have to endure this treatment that they're being exposed to. But also, in no other environment that children will find themselves in their adult lives will they likely be exposed to such a social milieu again. Because nowhere else in the real world are you divided by birth year and birthday and exact age. Even in college, it's different because colleges don't only admit you if you were born on a certain year or a certain day. You can be a freshman in college at 17, or you can be a freshman in college at 32. Everyone tends to be around the same age in college. There's still a broader range than there is in public school. And so the social pressures are different. And the bullying is significantly less intense. Why do we think it's important to expose our kids to that if they're not going to experience it at any other point in their adult lives? Why is this a skill that we think they need to have? Why is this a behavior that we accept as being normal? It doesn't make sense. This is actually a point that I want to sit on for a moment because I think this is a really important set of questions to ask yourself. the way we socialize kids in school is not a type of socialization they will be exposed to ever again. They're learning a very specific type of social skills that they're not going to need in the future in the same way that they need them inside the walls of a traditional school. Kids are learning a very specific type of peer-to-peer socialization. They're learning how to interact with people who are of almost the exact same age, often the same general demographic. They live in the same geographic region. They're interacting with people who are very much like them and almost no one else. And so the social skills that they're learning don't necessarily even transfer to the environments that they're going to be engaging in once they graduate from traditional school and engage in being full-fledged adults. One of the things that I've often heard homeschooling parents describe is the phenomenon of being in a group of homeschoolers and then watching the difference between the way those homeschoolers interact and the way the public school kids interact. Homeschooled kids are socialized in very different ways. Even if they're going to homeschool groups like a homeschool co-op or taking homeschool classes, there's often a broader age range of kids present. It's usually not just kids of the exact same grade. It's often a range, like elementary schoolers or middle schoolers. Sometimes a homeschool group will run the full gamut of kindergarten all the way through high school. And so even if your academic activities are done in a group of kids that are much closer to you in age, you're going to be exposed to a broad range of ages, and you're likely going to have significant interaction among a broad group of ages. You're also exposed to adults in a level that you're not in traditional school. Inside of a classroom, the only adults you're interacting with are your teachers, typically. And those are very clear-cut authority figures. There's a very strong dynamic and culture around that authority. The teachers have expectations of you. You're expected to meet those requirements. If you don't, you're going to get in trouble. And so all of your interactions with adults are painted in a very specific way. When you go to a homeschool group, you are typically interacting with a broad range of adults. Parents bring their kids to homeschool groups, and often they stay. So you're interacting with the moms of many of your friends and peers. Sometimes grandma comes along, sometimes dad comes along. You're interacting with a whole range of adults who are not an authority figure over you. Your friend's dad isn't going to tell you that you have to do something the way that your teacher is going to tell you you have to do something. And so you're having a very different type of interaction with adults that's much closer to peer than anything you would experience inside of a classroom. And those types of intergenerational, inter-age social interactions are much closer to the types of social interactions that you'll be having as an adult. And this is what homeschooling parents are talking about when they're talking about the difference between homeschool kids and public school kids, is that the homeschool kids are much less afraid of interacting with people who are not of the same age as them, because to them it's normal. And so it's comfortable. They have lots of practice interacting with older kids, younger kids, grown adults, whereas public school kids have only ever experienced adults as authority figures and have only ever experienced kids of their own age group. So if they're around a group of kids who are older than them or younger than them, or they're around a group of adults, it's much harder for them to interact and be comfortable because it's so unfamiliar. And yet, in the real world, these are almost all of the experiences that you're going to have. And so it's an important set of skills to develop. I also hate the argument that homeschoolers aren't going to be socialized, because it implies that learning how to interact with other people can only happen in a classroom. And homeschoolers are learning to interact with the real world in very different ways, but they're still having these experiences. When I was homeschooled, I would go out with my mom, often multiple times a week, to do real world things. We would go to the grocery store and grocery shop. We would go to the bank and make deposits. We would go to the library and check out books. We would handle business things that my parents needed to take care of. And I was along for all of those interactions, and I was interacting too. So even though I wasn't the one who was handling the banking transactions, I might have still been there talking to the teller. and observing how these real world social interactions happen. Because when you're an adult, the entire world around you is the fabric of your social reality. It's the place that you are interacting with other people. And so that's the skill set that you really need to develop. And if anything, public schoolers are being cloistered from that because they're in classrooms all day and not interacting with the real world, and have never had to talk to a bank teller, and have never had to talk to the librarian, have never had to go to the grocery store. And so arguably they're at a disadvantage because they're not getting these experiences that homeschooled kids are getting often during the day because they're not in school. So they're going along with mom when she's running her errands instead of her running her errands while they're in the classroom. I want to be fair about this. I don't want to just look at this with rosy colored glasses, because this was a big point of conflict for me internally when I was growing up. I wanted to be much more social than I was. Seeing my peers 1 or 2 days a week was not really fulfilling to me on a social level. I had imaginary friends when I was a kid. When I got older, I would fantasize about what it would be like to one day go to school and suddenly have a gaggle of friends. I deeply wanted to be more social than I was. And at the time, I thought that being more social would be a huge asset to my life. And to be fair, we did try to build a stronger social life for me. My family tried all different types of things. We tried different extracurricular programs. We joined different homeschool groups. And in some ways it was really hard because even though we'd find peers, people my age who had some shared interest or something in common, they were also homeschooled. So we were taking homeschool classes together. They were interested in singing like me, and so we can sing in choir together. It still was hard to find peers that I deeply and sincerely could connect with. And this is not an isolated experience that I had. This is true for kids. They're very unique individuals. And in the same way that sometimes it's hard for an adult to find someone they want to be friends with, in the same vein, sometimes it's hard for kids to find other kids that they relate to and that they want to be friends with. And I think in some ways that problem heightened as I got older and had more time to develop my unique interests. Like I said earlier, I really loved studying history and the Western canon, and I didn't know many people when I hit high school who were interested in that. It's just not a commonplace thing for a high schooler to want to do. And when I was in elementary school, this problem was already surfacing. I was such a tomboy when I was in elementary school. And I remember telling my mom that it was because I just thought the girls were boring. They didn't want to talk about anything that I found interesting. And the boys just didn't want to talk at all. They wanted to run around outside and play. And I was like, well, this is fun. I can do that. And so I hung out with all the boys in my homeschool co-op, less so because I was deeply and innately interested in the same thing as they were, but because it was a type of social interaction that spoke to me more, because I didn't want to sit around and talking about Polly Pocket and My Little Pony with the other girls in my homeschool group, because I just didn't relate to it. I was interested in different things. But because I wasn't in a social environment where I was running up against that every single day and feeling frustrated by the fact that I didn't have friends and feeling like a social outcast because I didn't like the same things that my peers did, I was able to just spend time on the things that I found interesting. And in retrospect, I'm deeply, deeply grateful for that, because I have a very deep and well-grounded sense of self. And I've had that ever since I was a kid. And I truly think that in part that is because I was allowed to be without other external pressures. And the only reason I had that was because I wasn't in a classroom all day and I wasn't being constantly socialized. So my argument whenever somebody tells me you shouldn't advocate for homeschooling because kids will be under socialized is that's a good thing. And we over socialize our kids. And I think we need to really seriously ask ourselves how much social time is beneficial and how much alone time is important for a child to develop their own sense of self. And I think the answer to that varies wildly between individual children. I likely would have benefited from more socialization than I had. Although in retrospect, I am very grateful for the childhood that I got to have and for the ways that I developed within it. But I likely would have thrived with a couple more days a week of socialization, especially if my family had been able to find a group of people who really fed my interests and who I was really able to relate to. But I'm also very grateful that I didn't have a full 5-day-a-week schedule of socialization the way most kids did, because I think there are things in me that would have gotten crushed if I had had that experience. If you're considering homeschooling your kids or you're second guessing the level of socialization that your child is having, I would leave you with a couple of things. One is there is no singular level of socialization that is right for every child. And a lot of it hinges both on your child's own nature and the level of socialization that they crave, but also the quality of the socialization that you're able to find for them. Being around kids your own age is not a blanket fix all problems solution to your child being lonely or feeling under socialized. The quality of those connections is just as important of a thing to weigh as your child's desire to be social. And also ask yourself, are we over socializing our kids? Is the standard I'm being held to even a thing that is good? And what is the baseline for the amount of socialization that would benefit my child versus the amount of their alone time to be and to explore and to become that I should defend in the pursuit of their development and their becoming into an adult that is confident, grounded, knows themselves, is self-confident and self-assured, and who is on a life path that they will thrive in and that they chose because they were excited about it and because they were interested in it and because they knew themselves enough to know that they would love it. Okay, there's a lot more about socialization that I could say and that I am sure I will in the future, but I'm going to leave you with that for now. If you made it all the way through, thank you so much for listening. I always appreciate you being here. We will be back next week with another episode, and until then, take care, and I'll see you next week.